the novelist is in a hard position when the country is at war or in some other deep crisis. Those crises, particularly war, are very dehumanizing. And part of the attraction, I think, if you are living through that of fiction, is that fiction is a deeply human thing, and you connect to something that is it's fragile, but it's also deeper and truer than the news of the day. And so it doesn't surprise me. This was well, a couple of stories. Well, actually just under one heading. So The Corrections, my novel, was published, let's see, 6 days before 9/11 in 2001. And you would think it would be a disaster for a novel to be published and then immediately have like the worst crisis in America in 50 years. But in fact, what I found when I managed to get on the road was that people were desperate to connect to something that was human and familiar. And that there was a heightened interest in fiction when I went out on the road, because people were they'd been watching the news for 12 hours a day after the attacks in New York and Washington. And so, but it would have been a very, very strange time to be trying to write a novel. And then in the ensuing months and years, people kept saying, well, when are you going to write a novel about 9/11? We need fiction writers to explain this. And my feeling was, that's the last thing in the world I want to write about. We were so immersed in it. We have all of these firsthand accounts. We were bombarded with information and analysis to the point of nausea for months and months and months. What is there left to say? It's precisely the last thing I would want to write a novel about, because we all went through it. What do we need a novel for?
It's a kind of such an interesting question, and it's what both of you have just said reminds me of two things. One is that I wrote a piece this spring in Kiev about the new bookshops springing up around central Kiev, which is an extremely paradoxical thing, but true. Beautiful new bookshops springing up around Kiev. And it was partly people were rediscovering reading in those terrible months when electricity and gas was being targeted by missiles, and people were forced into the candlelight reading. But it was also partly a kind of reaching for something human, as you say, and of course lots of literature in Ukrainian, which is a very important part of this. And the second thing, I suppose, is that there is time plays its part very deeply, I suspect, in this sort of idea of when can a novel be written, when should a novel be written, how much time, you know, the novel is written over a period of time. There are no shortcuts to writing a novel. It has to exist in a kind of long time period of its own, and in most cases has a relationship with time in its own form. I suppose I've recently spent quite a lot of time reading British Second World War novels, partly to make sense of what's going on now in a curious way. I think sort of reading novels about the Blitz somehow makes sense for me of being under a cruise missile attack in Kiev in some way. But those novels were written 10 or 15 years at least after the end of the Second World War. So, I mean, you alluded to this a moment ago, Andrey, but do you predict a kind of surge of novels, good novels about the war in 20, 30, 40 years? Or as John says, will it be that this war has been so minutely observed and so minutely chronicled in diaries, in blogs, in Instagram, in news reports, that writers will have to find some kind of tiny corner to open up fictionally?
Well, in fact, the situation in Ukraine is much more complicated than you think, because I mean, the war started in 2014, and between 2014 and February 22, over 400,000 Ukrainian men and women went through the front lines, and they created a parallel literature. In 2017, when I started the Grey Bees, there were already 200 books about war in Donbass, but these were mostly actually non-fiction books, diaries, personal notes, but also some novels. And there was not a single book about civilians, for example. It was only about bad guys and good guys, traitors and heroes, etc. And the professional traditional writers, I mean, they even didn't try first to enter this topic. I mean, now there are novels written by traditional writers, but now actually slowly these two literatures are merging. And also because we have about 30 writers on the front lines, and they are writing non-fiction from there. Probably some of them are also making notes for the fiction. But what I think, and the danger, is that after this war, we will have a cult of war literature for 10 or 15 years, exactly the same as happened in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. And in the Soviet time, this literature was used to indoctrinate the younger generations, to raise the spirit of patriotism. And I mean, I remember myself being a child and teenager and being offered only books and only films about the war. I mean, I think we will need a huge number of human stories, of crime stories, of adventure to have a balance. Because, I mean, you cannot have the whole generation of Ukrainians being interested only in the war that just finished. Because, I mean, the society is traumatized. Traumatized readers, they are not adequate when they're making choices. And then they became dictating actually what others should read. And also already now we have some propaganda novels, which always describe Ukrainian soldiers as heroes and excellent positive guys. And everybody else is a traitor. In fact, actually, I was accused because of the Grey Bees that I wrote a novel about separatists and not about Ukrainian heroes.
Jonathan, do jump in.
No, that sounds right. I was going to go in a slightly different direction and say that there is no, paradoxically, the best novels about wars get written much later. If you think about War and Peace, that was written way after Napoleon's invasion of Russia. If you think about Life and Fate, Vasily Grossman's great novel, not clear exactly when he was writing it, but he wasn't writing it in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. There have been, I think even 10 years ago, there have been 40,000 books published about the Vietnam War. That number is probably up to 50 or 60,000, but some of the best books, best novels about it have been more recent. Dennis Johnson's Tree of Smoke was written 40 years after the Vietnam War, and yet, it seems like it takes that kind of perspective when you are in the midst of that patriotic moment. It's harder to see clearly. And there is the risk that it becomes propaganda of a certain kind. But there's also, I would say, a difference between novels of war and novels of wartime. And the reason I think, going all the way back to Homer, there's been this fascination with wartime, is that it really feels like everyone is just like completely energized. Life is more intense when you are in a situation of war, and relationships become more intense. Political feelings become more intense. Everything becomes intensified, and novelists like intensity, and I think that's part of the attraction of it. It doesn't need to be a novel of the front lines. It can be behind the lines, it's still, there's a war going on, and it's great material.
Well, yeah, I suspect you're right. It's absolutely no coincidence that the first kind of great European poem is Homer's Iliad, and you know, in which it's set, as you say, during the Trojan War, and in which the stakes could not be higher, because the stakes are life and death, and that is the stuff of which story. That's the basic material of storytelling, isn't it?